The neighborhood has always been a quiet place. Well-kept houses, gardens trimmed to the millimeter, children playing on impeccable sidewalks. Everything seemed perfect, at least until someone started bothering the wrong person. Karen, or rather, that woman with the disturbing obsession with control, had always had a habit of meddling in her neighbors' lives. It was as if she breathed HOA regulations. For her, every fence had to be the right height, every blade of grass had to be the right shade of green, and anything outside the norm had to be exterminated like a plague. And that's how all hell broke loose. The family that had recently arrived in the neighborhood consisted of a couple and their 2 teenage children. Polite, discreet people, with no record of trouble or tendency towards noisy parties. But none of that mattered to Karen. She had a keen nose for picking on the wrong people, and this time she decided to target them. Her first complaint was almost comical. The color of their car doesn't match the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Yes, because now Karen was also an expert in automotive color matching. When this accusation didn't stick, she decided to innovate. She spread rumors that the family was accumulating garbage in the yard, something completely untrue. Then the story changed to, they have a dog that barks too much. Only the family didn't even own a dog. But Karen had no limits. Realizing that her petty complaints were having no effect, she upped the ante. One day, the woman had the audacity to call an HOA meeting exclusively to discuss the problem with that house. It was as ridiculous an event as it sounded, but, as usual, the half-dozen sycophants who loved a gossip were ready to listen. We have to maintain neighborhood standards, and this family is giving us serious problems, she exclaimed dramatically, as if she were denouncing a criminal scheme on an international scale. Someone asked what exactly these serious problems were, and that's when Karen shone in the art of being a charlatan. They're using the house for illegal business. I saw suspicious movement at night. Strange people coming and going. We can't allow this. If there was one thing that woman knew how to do, it was to dramatize any situation until it sounded like a script for a crime movie. Her plan was clear. Put pressure on the HOA to impose absurd fines until the family had no choice but to sell the house. She had done this before, with other neighbors who dared to challenge her tyranny. But this time, Karen chose the wrong person to play with. What she didn't know was that the owner of the house, Isabel, had a profession that made the whole situation interesting. Isabel wasn't just a wife and mother. She was a private investigator, and a good one. Her job involved finding fraud, exposing lies, and digging up dirt that people tried to hide. If Karen wanted to play at falsifying accusations, then she was about to enter a game she didn't know how to play. When Isabel began to notice the strange movements of the HOA and the growing number of invented complaints, her nose for trouble went off. She had already dealt with cheats, scammers, and criminals in her profession, so a corrupt HOA and a bossy woman weren't exactly a challenge. The first thing she did, track down every complaint. As predicted, nothing held up. The second? Start digging into Karen's life. Because a woman who makes a point of being the unofficial ruler of the neighborhood probably has skeletons in her closet. And Isabel had the right tools to find those skeletons. She spent a few nights gathering information. She discreetly talked to old neighbors, checked public records, scoured old HOA posts, and that's how she found something really interesting. It turns out that the owner of the neighborhood wasn't so perfect. For starters, Karen had tried to set up other neighbors in the past. Some had even moved out after a flurry of ridiculous fines and endless lawsuits. But the juiciest thing, she had a financial history that would make any accountant swoon. There were records of embezzlement from the HOA itself, small amounts, over the years, that could easily be overlooked by any inattentive person. But Isabel wasn't just anyone. She knew fraud when she saw it. And Karen? Well, the woman had no idea she was about to be unmasked in the very game she had invented. Isabel wasn't just angry. She was determined. This war had only just begun. Karen had never been a subtle woman. She loved to feel that she had power, that she could manipulate the HOA rules to shape the neighborhood in her image and likeness. Only now, without knowing it, she had stepped into a minefield. While she spent her days spewing venom and spreading rumors, Isabel worked behind the scenes. It wasn't the first time she'd dealt with people like this, people with an inflated ego and an unhealthy need for control. The only difference was that this time the target was her own family, and that made the game much more interesting. The first thing Isabel did was pull up the HOA's financial records. Nothing too complicated. A few queries in public databases, a look at the annual balance sheets, and, of course, some strategic calls to neighbors who had already had problems with the mystery fees that appeared out of nowhere. And there it was. Fraud. It wasn't huge, but enough to raise suspicions. Small embezzlements over the years, always disguised as neighborhood maintenance, structural improvements, or any other pretty jargon that masked the obvious. Karen was sticking her hand in the HOAs till every chance she got. Now Isabel just needed a few more pieces of evidence. Meanwhile, Karen continued her offensive. After the ridiculous meeting in which she tried to convince the other HOA members that Isabel's family was a problem for the neighborhood, she decided it was time to up the ante. If fines and invented complaints didn't work, then she would try something more direct. That's how, one fine day, Isabel found an HOA inspector in her backyard, taking pictures of the house's facade. "May I ask what the hell you're doing in my yard?" Isabel asked, crossing her arms. The man, a visibly uncomfortable middle-aged man, looked at her as if he would rather be anywhere else. "The HOA has received complaints that your house is out of compliance with neighborhood regulations." "Oh, right. The classic. And what standards would those be?" He scratched his head. "Well, the paintwork on the facade isn't exactly up to standard. And there's also the matter of the vegetation in the yard, which doesn't seem to comply." In other words, Karen had sent this poor devil to try and find any excuse for yet another absurd fine. Isabel took a deep breath. She could just explode right there. But no, she was smarter than that. "Good. Then send me all these alleged infractions in writing, along with the exact regulations I'm violating, and I'll be happy to look into it. Now, if you don't want me to call the police for trespassing, get out of my yard." The inspector needed no further encouragement. When Karen heard that her tactic hadn't worked, she was furious. And angry people make mistakes. That's when she made a fatal mistake. She sent an official letter from the HOA threatening eviction. Not fines, not warnings. Eviction. For someone who thought she knew how to play the game, Karen really didn't understand anything about the law. First, an HOA doesn't have the power to evict anyone. That's a much more complex legal issue than a simple whim of a control freak woman. Second, any judge worthy of the title would kick that threat to the curb. And that's exactly where it got interesting. What Karen didn't know, apart from the fact that Isabel was an investigator, was that Isabel's husband was a renowned judge. In other words, this threat had the same effect as a 5-year-old trying to intimidate an adult with a monster drawing. Isabel looked at the letter and laughed. She laughed out loud. It was so pathetic it was hard to believe. But since Karen wanted to make it cool, then cool it would be. That night, while Karen was probably imagining herself celebrating her victory, Isabel was putting together a dossier. She had everything: the HOA's fraudulent embezzlement records, previous cases of neighbors being intimidated and coerced into selling their homes, the illegal eviction threats sent by Karen, and now the icing on the cake, a recording of a very interesting conversation. Isabel had already prepared herself for the possibility of confronting some HOA official about the dubious practices. So when she called the association's accountant with some questions, she recorded it all. "Does Ms. Karen personally handle these funds?" she asked, with an innocent tone. The accountant hesitated. "Well, technically, yes. She oversees the spending." "And who oversees this spending?" Silence. "Ah, yeah. Well, we trust her, you know. She's always taken good care of it." "You do." "Of course they do. The recording was a bombshell. If there had been any doubt that Karen was managing money suspiciously, there was now. The next day, Isabel took all this paperwork and sent it to a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, one who specialized in corrupt HOAs. The counterattack had begun. Meanwhile, Karen still had no idea of the avalanche that was about to fall on her. In her mind, the plan was working. She was just waiting for the moment when that problem family would run out of money and sell the house. But Isabel wasn't like the other neighbors, and contrary to what Karen thought, she was never at a dead end. She was just waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. And that moment was coming. Karen woke up that morning certain that she was in control of the situation. For her, the plan was working perfectly. With each passing day, the pressure on Isabel and her family increased. She had already spread enough rumors for some of the neighbors to start looking down on them, and now, with the threat of eviction sent, she imagined that it wouldn't be long before Isabel threw in the towel. After all, that was how it always worked. She had done it before. Some families who didn't fit her ideal of the perfect neighborhood ended up selling their homes just to avoid the headache. Some simply didn't have the time or patience to face a manipulated HOA. Others didn't have the means to fight the bureaucratic tricks. But this time, something was strange. Isabel was expected to appear nervous, worried, trying to negotiate or, better still, disappear altogether. Instead, the woman seemed calm. This bothered Karen. She had expected to see Isabel reacting like the others. But no, the day after she sent the letter, she saw her neighbor walking around the neighborhood, calm, as if nothing was happening. She chatted to a few people and smiled. Something was wrong. Karen thought it best to press even harder. She called a new HOA meeting, this time with a more direct objective, to convince the members that Isabel's family was a risk to the community. With the same theatrics as always, she said that these people were defying neighborhood rules, that they had already received several warnings, and that now, officially, the association was taking measures to protect the integrity of the neighborhood. Of course, it was all a lot of theater. She wanted the HOA to be on her side, to agree with every lie she made up. If she had enough support, she could push even harder, maybe even get a lawyer willing to go through with the eviction. But there, in the middle of the meeting, something unexpected happened. One of the HOA members, a gray-haired gentleman who was always quiet during these meetings, raised his hand and asked calmly, "Are you sure this is the best approach?" Karen froze for a moment. "What do you mean?" The man snorted. "Well, this family has never caused any real problems. None of us have seen anything like what you're saying. I don't know. Maybe we should have more concrete proof before making such a drastic decision." Evidence. The word Karen hated the most. She tried to get around it. She said that she had already received many complaints, some of which were anonymous, but reliable. But there, for the first time, she realized that not everyone was as blindly on her side as she had hoped. The meeting ended without the unanimous support she wanted. And then came the fatal blow. The next day, Karen received a formal summons. The reason? Embezzlement of HOA money, harassment of residents, and misuse of her position in the Association for Personal Persecution. When she read it, her heart raced. The paperwork was official. Isabel wasn't bluffing. While Karen was playing at manipulating meetings and inventing accusations, Isabel was busy gathering evidence. The financial records were all there. The suspicious payments, the small withdrawals masked as administrative fees. The documents were reviewed by a specialist lawyer who had no trouble finding irregularities. And now, it wasn't just Isabel against Karen. It was justice against Karen. The subpoena made it clear that there was a lawsuit in progress and that investigations were being opened into the HOA's finances. And best of all, some of the association's own members were already jumping ship. The accountant who had hesitated to answer Isabel's questions, he himself contacted the lawyers to clarify what he knew. After all, no one wanted to go down with Karen. She tried to fight back in desperation. She sent emails to HOA members saying that it was all just a misunderstanding, that she was being set up. She went to some neighbors' houses to justify herself, but now the game had changed. People began to avoid her. For the first time in a long time, Karen felt what it was like to be on the other side. At first, she refused to believe that anything could really happen to her. She had spent years manipulating that association, deceiving neighbors, imposing absurd fines, and pushing out those who didn't fit her pattern. But now, no one seemed willing to defend her. And then came the real coup de grace. A few days after the summons, another document arrived on her doorstep. This time, a formal notice from the HOA itself, informing her that she was being removed from office. The woman who had spent years reigning over the neighborhood, controlling every detail and thinking herself untouchable, was now just another ordinary resident. No power, no influence, and, worst of all, with a lawsuit about to explode all over her. She tried to contest it, threatened to sue, but it didn't matter anymore. And Isabel? Well, Isabel just watched from afar, satisfied. After all, she knew from the start that this was a war Karen could never win. Karen had always thought she was invincible. She had spent years manipulating rules, terrorizing neighbors, and turning the HOA into her own private little kingdom. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt the bitter taste of defeat. After being stripped of the HOA presidency, her standing in the neighborhood plummeted like a house of cards in the wind. The neighbors who once pretended to respect her now ignored her. The few remaining sycophants were already walking away, pretending they never had anything to do with her decisions. And the worst part, the case against her was moving fast. In the days following the summons, the situation only got worse. Isabel had been meticulous in building the case against Karen, and now what was once just a suspicion was becoming a real scandal. The HOA's accounts began to be officially investigated, and embezzlement was soon confirmed. The association, which no longer wanted anything to do with Karen, started collaborating with Isabel's lawyers to clean up its image. None of them wanted to be associated with a corruption scandal at community level. That's when an even worse detail emerged for Karen. The fines she arbitrarily imposed on her neighbors had no legal backing. All those ridiculous fees she had pushed on Isabel and other residents over the years, they were all illegal. And now, those who had paid were demanding their money back. The final blow came on a seemingly ordinary day. Karen was at home, trying to maintain what little remained of her dignity, when she received an unexpected visit. 2 bailiffs knocked on her door. They weren't police officers, not yet, but they were carrying something that was just as terrible for her. Documents notifying her that she was officially being sued for fraud and bullying. It was then that the truth hit her. She tried to argue, she tried to justify herself, but the truth was that there was no one else to listen to her. For years, she had abused the power she had, always believing that she would never face consequences. But now, she was alone. And the worst part? Karen, who had always used the HOA to get people out of the neighborhood, was now about to be forced out. The lawsuit demanded that she return the embezzled sums, pay damages for the abuses committed, and cover the legal costs of everyone involved. The sum was absurd, far more than she could afford. The woman who had spent years evicting neighbors was now being evicted by the very system she had created. The house she had prided herself on running was now threatened with being taken over to cover the compensation. With no support, no resources, and her name tarnished in the neighborhood, there was only one option left: sell the house and leave before the situation got any worse. And so, a few months later, Karen disappeared. No goodbyes, no big announcements, no arrogant speeches she used to make at HOA meetings. Just a moving truck pulling up in front of her house and taking her belongings away. Gone, like a shadow. And the neighborhood? It moved on as if it had never existed. The HOA has undergone a complete overhaul. Abusive fees were eliminated. Rules were adjusted so that no one could ever abuse power again. The new president, someone truly committed to the community, worked to repair the damage caused by years of authoritarianism. And Isabel? Well, she carried on with her life, quietly, as she always should have been. She never wanted a fight, never wanted trouble. But when they tried to force her family out, she did what any sensible person would do. She fought, and she won. Because at the end of the day, Karen's power had always been an illusion. An illusion that, when confronted with the truth, crumbled completely. And that's how the reign of the worst HOA Karen that neighborhood ever had ended. No glory, no honors, no nothing. Just the weight of her own choices crushing her. And no one missed her. And if you liked it too, don't forget to comment and leave a like.